So these concentration camps are still in existence, and they're still here for the rest of us, should they decide to use them. So 70% of Japanese in America were either naturalized citizens or American-born at the start of World War II. Journalist Henry McLemore urged the government to herd them up, pack them off, let them be pinched, hurt, hungry, and dead up against it. I hate Japanese. So, if you're allowed to put that in print, you're going to resonate with other people that have that. So long-standing anti-Japanese immigration laws were strengthened, laws against intermarriage with whites, exclusion from pool and dance halls, ban from certain jobs, and middle-class housing. The Immigration Act in 1924 prohibited further immigration from Japan and made 47,000 of the Japanese-born people living in the U.S. ineligible for naturalization. Now, to point out this whole immigration piece that we're still wrestling with, because there's basically racial policies built into immigration, obviously. This is one piece of evidence of that. So who should get preferential treatment for immigration? We should at least state what that policy is and why. All right, so, we want more South Asians to come in to work in information tech because they're so good at it. What? We should have more Russians come in? Yeah. What is the justification here? Where? I'm particularly ticked off about this after having to read somebody of a somewhat of a racist bent and his Facebook page and what he puts up on his Facebook page. Like, you reading that in my office? In front of me? Who is this? Excuse me, Pilgrim. Avenge December 7th, right? So there you have your Aryan man, working class, blue collar. That looks like the superscripture of, it must be the Arizona, right? Probably, yeah. Right, when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, right? So after Pearl Harbor, of course, there were irrational fears of further attacks on U.S. soil. These fears included possible enemy, German, Italian, Japanese, collaborators among those living in the U.S. So the most lived in easily identifiable ethnic neighborhoods, though of course the Japanese would stand out more, but understand that because of long-standing discrimination in effect in the 40s, Italians lived in Italian neighborhoods. Germans lived in German neighborhoods. Right? Ben Franklin didn't like the fact there were Germans in Philly. Wrote about it because Germans were the Hessians who were mercenaries under the British. Yeah, an American patriot might have some feelings about that, but they stayed because the British lost, and here we are. Love your sauerkraut and dark beer. I know that was racist, but hey. All right, so most were not citizens due to strict and targeted immigration laws, right? So that ethnic slur, WAP, basically means without official papers. It's literally what it means, without official papers. So Italians are being denied, not only Italians, but European immigrants are being denied access even though they're here. And there wasn't a clear path to become citizens. But if their kids were born here, they were citizens. Right? Which is why they would have to participate, for example, in underground economy activities to feed themselves. Right? So strict and targeted immigration laws. So, day after Pearl Harbor, the government used several tactics to deal with suspected enemy collaborators. The FBI arrested and jailed thousands of Italians, Germans, and Japanese suspects. Now, they probably didn't commit any crime other than their ancestry. But they were suspected, just like I'm of terrorist descent. Right? Because when slavery is legal and you work to free slaves, you're a terrorist. So most were placed on a list even before the U.S. entered the war. Other agencies pursued the relocation of thousands of Italians, Germans, and Japanese away from areas deemed vital to the security of the U.S., for example, ports, defense plants, military installations, all that kind of stuff. All right, so not to give you the impression that it's just Japanese, ethnics have other descriptions, but what the Japanese described was that, okay, we're behind barbed wire and we're kept behind a fence, but the Germans and the Italians get to go to work in agriculture and return to their camps, which don't have barbed wire on them. So there's a racial divide there as well. So, fishing vessels, radios, cameras, and weapons were confiscated from Italians living in coastal areas of California. Curfews were established, placing Italians essentially under house arrest during the evening and night. During the day, they are allowed to work under supervision. Nearly 6,000 Germans were taken into custody. Though on U.S. soil, captured Nazi officers were allowed into officers' clubs on U.S. bases, while American officers of color were forbidden to enter. Okay, this was depicted in both Tuskegee Airmen movies, where they, in one time they get in a bar fight in Italy, but also, I think in the one with Lawrence Fishburne in it, they're talking about a base on U.S. soil where they're going to the officers' club because they're lieutenants and captains, and no, the Nazis can drink beer, you can't, nigger. On U.S. soil.
Yeah, that happened to my father. He was German. But he was admitted into the army as an interpreter. He got special treatment.
Because of his skill set, huh? So, who is the enemy? So, notice that, of course, none of the captains of industry who have been trading with the enemy for, at this point, the better part of a decade, like the Bush family, whose business, Union Bank, directly literally put the brown shirts on the back of the brown shirts. They ain't going to jail. So, protecting against Nazi collaborators. So, 9066. All Japanese, regardless of citizenship, age, gender, place of birth, or pronouncements of loyalty, were taken into custody and interned. In a message from FDR to military headquarters, the Presidio, go ahead and do anything you think necessary to protect the West Coast from potential Japanese spies and sabotage. If it involves citizens, we'll take care of them too. There will probably be repercussions, but it has to be dictated by military necessity. Okay, so, but people doing business with the enemy, providing steel, oil, coal, computers, communications, and bomb fuses, poison gas for the gas chambers, and brown shirts are not collaborators. They're businessmen. So, late one evening, so a true patriot, in my estimation, late one evening, March of 1942, just 3.5 months after the attack of Pearl Harbor, a young graduate of the University of Oregon Law School walked into the street outside his home in Portland. He carried his birth certificate and a copy of a military curfew order and demanded that he be arrested. Guided by faith in the American Constitution and its promise of equal protection, well, that was that amendment. them amendments, okay. And he is a lawyer, so he believes, having read the law, that it don't apply to him, so he knows that it ain't. But that's the point, right? He studied as a law student and sworn an oath to protect as a second lieutenant in the Army. Minoru Min Yasui, a 25-year-old Japanese American, approached the first police officer and demanded that the officer uphold the military curfew and place him under arrest. Okay, Lieutenant. Sure. Earlier that evening, he called the FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland to notify him of his intention to break the curfew order issued by John DeWitt, which we saw the other day, head of the Western Defense Command, restricting all people of Japanese American descent to their homes at night on the grounds that it was unconstitutional. In an ignoble start to an epic civil rights case that would stretch over 45 years and reach the Supreme Court more than once, the young lawyer suddenly determined to reestablish his right as a citizen and was told by the police officer to run along or I will turn you in. The officer then walked away. Wow, you can't even engage in peaceful civil rights. Break the law in front of a cop. Where is the cop when you need him? So he did run along straight to the nearest police station where he explained his violation of the curfew and demanded arrest. He was rewarded with a jail cell, beginning a titanic legal battle, testing the endurance of American civil liberties in wartime. Now, what happens when we're in war? Now, like we're in a condition of war. Now, even though up to this point, you declare war against nation states. What happens when you're fighting against, well, a group? That is not a nation. That's the territory that we've been exploring in the last decade since 9/11. What do civil liberties look like? So, for the next 9 months, Min's case rose up the federal court system. He would be held in isolation at the county jail in a 6-by-8 foot cell, denied contact with relatives. He would learn from his lawyer that his family and all the Japanese Americans of the West Coast, more than 110,000 people, had been rounded up, packed in a train, shipped to the most isolated parts of the country, locked and camped on suspicion that all Japanese Americans were disloyal, and over 2/3 of those detained, like Min, were American citizens. So when the Supreme Court promulgated a decision in June of 43, a year later, there's another in a series of decisions that shocked the conscience, if you're going to be shocked by this kind of stuff. The court did reinstate his citizenship, which had been taken away by a lower court. It ruled that the curfews against Japanese Americans were justified by military necessity. So within a year, the Supreme Court went further in the case of Korematsu versus U.S. In a 6-3 decision, court declared the internment of all the West Coast Japanese American population to be similarly justified. One dissenting justice denounced the decision as the legalization of racism. I thought racism was legal. Oh, anyway. All right. So when he was released from jail into the Minidoka internment camp in Idaho, one could excuse him if he was angry with the government that had declared him, his family, and 120,000 others to be a danger to their country. Instead, he volunteered for the newly created 442nd Army Regiment, an all-Japanese American regiment, when he was denied the right to join due to his status as a convicted felon. Wait, wasn't he a lieutenant? Oh. He became one of the regiment's his biggest recruiting agents in the camp, the 442nd, mostly made up of men who had families behind barbed wire, would fight in Italy and France, and by the end of the war, be the most decorated unit of the Army. So from the description I gave the other day about what the orders, you could basically carry, all your belongings, what you could carry, bedding, et cetera, et cetera. This is a picture of what that looks like. If you haven't visited the installation down at the Hult Center, that's a bronze sculpture with a girl reaching up towards a butterfly, et cetera. It's cool. This is a typical camp. So I am an American, where this person is basically, there's other signs in other windows about banning Japanese, but that's why, of course, you're an American, obviously. This is so kindler, gentler concentration camps. Assistant Secretary of War John Cloy, I wonder if anyone realizes the speed and humanity with which the evacuation of the Japanese had been handled by the Army on the West Coast. I'm struck with the extreme care that has been taken to protect the persons and goods and even the comforts of each individual. Our wartime treatment of Japanese aliens and citizens of Japanese descent on the West Coast has been hasty, unnecessary, and mistaken. The course of action with which we undertook was no way required or justified by the circumstances of the war. Different point of view. But also remember, the laws that enable this still exist. So people talk about reparations. So in '88, Reagan signed legislation that awarded $20,000 to every surviving Japanese American who had been interned. Also recognized the courage and valor of the all Japanese 442nd. We are here to right a grave wrong. It is not for us to pass judgment on those who made mistakes, and yet the internment was just that, a mistake. Mistakes were made. In '88, payments were not the first to be made to the victims of internment. In the mid-'40s, the government paid out in excess of $100 million to internees. Japanese losses were easily 3 times as much as that, in terms of that financially. Today's an important day in the healing and growth of our country. Redress is a victory for everyone because it reminds us that our country is guided by the principles of freedom and justice for all. Without any irony, he can say that. So I had asked, there was a panel just before, about several years before the internment memorial was installed at the Hult, and I was able to ask a member of the 442nd, why, I'm still trying to wrap my mind of who goes to fight for a country that puts you in concentration camps. How do you do that? What justifies that? How do you do that in your mind? I'm trying to understand that. Because clearly you say it's, yes, it's racism, and you said that all the way through. Yeah, it's obvious. I can't fault Min for his standing, being a lawyer, standing on the principles of the Constitution and, striking that higher balance. But it's one thing to go to the camps, have all your property taken away, your liberty taken away, and then go fight for these folks elsewhere. How do you do that?
You have to put yourself in the context of that era, because there was virtually no dissent against that war, World War II, and the hysteria was so great that it was, you could not fight against it. Literally.
I understand that. But here's what his answer was. I wasn't fighting for a politician. Yes, of course, I'm fighting for my family. I'm thinking about them while I'm fighting, that I might never ever see them again, but that's not what I'm fighting for. I'm definitely not fighting for a politician or the politicians. You might be fighting for the people next to you because that's what you do in wartime, but that's not what I'm fighting for. And he said, I'm fighting for a country that is incapable of doing what it did to me. So that is, I'm fighting for a United States that is already beyond racism. It doesn't exist yet. And if I don't fight for it now, it won't exist. So that's why I'm fighting. Wow. Okay. All right. That I could live with. Because I understand the wartime and can't speak out against the war, just like, you can't speak out against, Osama bin Laden. My thing was, okay, knowing that he was trouble, why didn't you kill him when you took him to Afghanistan on the CIA flight? Spend $1 billion, have a real good hitman, and off him. Save us the casualties. If you're going to do that, I'm not justifying doing that, but y'all going to do that anyway, as we will see next term with Africans. So, victory in Europe, victory in Japan. VE and VJ. Victory in Europe, victory in Japan. We won. We fought for freedom and democracy with valor and honor at great cost. We put our differences aside, kinda, sorta. So, in war movies, because I grew up with war movies. One of my work studies said, I put down John Wayne. I like John Wayne. Okay, Marion Michael Morrissey. Well, who's that? No, that's John Wayne's real name, because he thought Marion was a girl's name. So, okay, certain image, war movies. Right? I grew up, playing Army. But I never saw any black people. We were all over there. Saving Private Ryan. See any black people in that movie? Well, you did, but they weren't in the camera shot. Okay? So, the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan. In the background, you see those balloons? Those are being held by black people. All black regiments. Why cover just one part of the war if we're there? Oh well, Saving Private Ryan, white guy, right? But yeah, we did have yes, there were segregated units. Black people were in the war. We didn't start making black people war movies until after the 60s.
Jim Brown.
Jim Brown, right?
Dirty Dozen.
Right. So, did you ever hear about African American participation in the war before this class? Some of you might have. Jim Brown, right? The movies, right? No. Well, there was extensive involvement, right? So, war movies like the Battle of the Bulge, Fighting Leathernecks, Patton, Saving Private Ryan. We were there, even if we weren't depicted in the movies. We were there. So, Billie Holiday sang about strange fruit. Like World War I, black soldiers returned to America only to be lynched in uniform. Paul Robeson did concert tours to raise money for the troops. He and Einstein, like we saw the other day, asked Truman to make a public statement against lynching of soldiers. Truman refused and suggested Robeson was a communist for even raising the issue, which, of course, he never joined the party, but somehow equality is a communist value, not a capitalist value. So here in Oregon, basically Eugene experience was typical. If you were a soldier of color, you could not buy the home of your choice wherever you wanted. In Eugene, you could not even buy a house within the city limits. Discrimination was perfectly legal. This is the late Senator Mark Hatfield. I interviewed him in his office. In Portland. As a Salem High School student, he organized a concert series which brought Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson to Salem. After a stunning concert, Paul was not allowed to stay in the finest hotel in Salem because he was black. So Mark was so embarrassed that he borrowed the family car and personally drove Robeson to the Benson in Portland, which, if you don't know fancy hotels,
That's a nice one.
it's a nice one. So during the war, he was at Iwo Jima and walked through Hiroshima. He was a lieutenant on the landing craft at Iwo Jima. So they were getting shot at too, and walked through Hiroshima 2 days after the bomb went off. So this is actually what his wartime experience actually is what cemented his anti-war stance that he was famous for. So after his return from the war, he worked on the public accommodations bill, which had failed 10 times before the war due to the efforts of the owner of that hotel in Salem. In 1953, it was finally passed, and he credited his experience with having that bill passed and his persistence with his experience with Robeson. So, I was actually interviewing Senator because an elder, Willie Mims, had thought that Senator had brought Robeson to Eugene. That was actually not accurate according to the Senator. So I pursued other leads, and there was a family that used to live here, a white family that was into civil rights to the degree that you could be within that time period. So they knew Paul and brought Paul Robeson to Tent City. Now, so the reason it's called Ferry Street or Tent City, the misnomer is they didn't live in tents. That was actually the E-Web wood lot when E-Web had a wood-fired plant to generate steam. So the excess wood was used to build shacks and houses. This is outside of the city limits at the time. So there's no power, no electricity, and people actually had the money to buy or rent houses, but were not allowed to live within the city limits of Eugene, even if they could buy or rent. So they lived across the river in what's now Alton Baker Park, across from Lithia Nissan, I think is. But actually, Lithia Nissan was part of the park then, because the park was basically undeveloped land. The road that is now Centennial was called Old Patterson Road. So, Tent City was the community outside the city limits where for close to a century transients had lived. It's home to a thriving not only African American community, so it wasn't all black, but it was integrated, which was also against the law, but since it's outside the county limits, yeah. So people of color not allowed to live within the city limits of Eugene, and his only Eugene appearance, Paul sang in the Ferry Street Chapel. So this is a previous member of the class whose parents and family were part of the original Tent City Ferry Street community. So some folks don't like the term Tent City because it wasn't actually a tent. They lived in wood houses. But you could get the impression that that it was a tent city from, I think, a picture that's later in this sequence. So what she went to is went to the archives of the University of Oregon to find a map that looked like, basically it showed the city limits. So this dark line, and this is the river edge, is the city limits of Eugene just before 1949. So you can see that the city limits basically take this weird juke and around City View, and then end at Lorraine Road.
Where would I-5 be?
I-5 would be following the river
Right there.
here, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But it's 99 then. I'm old enough to remember when the interstate system didn't exist.
And it's still
in their
not
building.
bad.
Yeah. So,
99.
yeah, 99. Basically, 5 is following the old 99. So, when it says the new Ferry Street Bridge, literally what happened here is because there had been a transient camp into the 19th century, there was a ferry. Basically, pulling like wagons across, et cetera, at this point. And then they constructed a wooden bridge. and then a steel bridge, and now the current bridge, which is built in 49. So city limits are out here. All this is Alton Baker Park. Old Patterson Road is right here, and this is Centennial. Yeah. Okay, it was Old Patterson Road with the centennial of the state. In 1959, they changed Old Patterson Road to Centennial. And I'm just giving you a preview of one of the things that we'll deal with when we get to the late 80s and 90s, when we're basically trying to fight to get Martin Luther King Boulevard. Some people objected because it was centennial and we have to celebrate Oregon's history. And I go, okay, so did the Patterson family object to you changing Patterson Road to Centennial? So I asked that question, you know me, right? And by the way, was that Patterson the same Patterson as part of the Ku Klux Klan that successfully petitioned to get 2 Catholic teachers fired out of the Eugene School District? That Patterson? Is that who you're talking about? So, Patterson family didn't object. I think it's kind of a delicious irony to rename Martin Luther King Boulevard after a street that used to be named for a Klansman. I'm just saying.
Delicious.
I like the taste of that irony. Can I have a little habanero jelly with that? So, Old Patterson Road, Centennial, Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, so-called Tent City, Ferry Street. So, for example, this is from the Oregon Historical Society. So, if you notice, this is, I just captured this document because it was precious. The issue of migrant farm labor also warrants further study. Most written material regarding the harvesting focus on the contribution of local laborers. Thus far, no written documentation of migrant workers or workers' camps reputedly located in the Ferry Street Bridge area has been located. The Lane County Farm was located for many years on Coburg Road at Kinney Loop. What was the relationship between the institution and the local population? Why was the county farm located there? What was its history? Finally, a thematic study of floriculture within this district may be appropriate given its local associations with various family and business histories, Chase, Pruitt, etc. So this is from the Historical Society. Notice they are not commenting at all about the fact that this group of migrant workers is blacks and whites. No comment at all. Children of migrant workers gathering at water pump at the Ferry Street Bridge settlement outside of Eugene, 1949. So I'm saying, right, Ferry Street was mixed race, yes. Okay, maybe they were migrant workers because there are bean fields and other things that are being grown there, which I think there might be another aerial photograph that will show that. But, okay, by characterizing them as migrant farm workers, like they're just going to come seasonally and leave, that wasn't the case. There's no other way to say this. They's whitewashing something. But it's Oregon history, right? So, of course, they would do that. So, this is the Ferry Street Chapel. And so you could see here that, this is actually a 40 by 20 army tent. For a while, the BSU here was doing a Ferry Street reenactment because we were noticing that, okay, wait, the Civil War people dress up as Confederates and all that kind of stuff, and they do their little reenactments. Oregon was not really part of the Civil War. Why don't we do a reenactment of Black history? Let's buy an army tent. Boom. And then have a Black History exhibit in it. Did that for a couple of years in a row. We still have the tent. It's kind of moldy because both times we mounted this, it was raining, and you know what rain does to heavy canvas duck. Anyway, duck the fabric, not the animal, but anyway. So this is a 20 by 40 army tent over a wooden structure. Right, to insulate it and also to protect it from the rain, which is fairly ubiquitous. Ferry Street Chapel is now St. Mark's CME Church on Sam Reynolds Street and West 11th by Bertelson. Land covenant, establishing redlining, real estate apartheid. These were legal basically until the federal laws made them illegal in 1965. Let's see if I've got underlining here. No. Okay. Number 4, no persons other than those of the Caucasian race shall own, use, lease, or occupy any portion of said premises, providing that this restriction shall not prevent occupancy by a domestic servant of a different race employed by an owner or tenant and occupant of the premises specified. Okay, so this is, how many of you bought houses here? All right, so you know in the title search, right, you get all the documents. Well, this is part of that. This was actually given to me by OUR Credit Union when they still existed. They actually blanked out the actual address, but they knew that I was like a local history buff. I said, yeah, I wanted one in my when I bought my house, but it didn't have any. Shucks. But here it is. Not making that up, of course. Right? So these were legal until they were made illegal in 65 by the feds. All right. Ho Chi Minh. So one of the other things, the side effects of interviewing Senator Hatfield, who is on my top 5 favorite list of Republicans, and you would know that to make that list, you have to do something pretty special in my estimation. So one of the things that he talked about was Ho Chi Minh was our ally. And I go, what? Wait a minute.
Absolutely.
Are you, because I'd never learned that. Right? We were called communists because we had our little Mao Red books in high school and, carried, National Liberation Front flags for protesting the Vietnam War, but I didn't know any of
They
that.
helped get rid of the Japanese at the end of World War II. Out of Vietnam.
Hey, stop stealing my lecture, okay?
Sorry.
So, this is Ho Chi Minh proclaiming Vietnamese independence. So, remember, this is the communist who spoke out who defended black American soldiers and other victims of lynching when no American president would. An Asian communist, a German American Jewish genius, a black genius are all speaking out against lynching, but no American president will say a damn word. So, this Declaration of Independence, and this is what he called it. So, peep this. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lead paragraph. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples on the earth are equal from birth, and all the peoples have a right to live, to be happy and free. Uncle Ho can be forgiven poetic license, because this is not, in fact, what Thomas Jefferson meant by those words. But he's reinterpreting it for the 20th century. Okay, I'll give you that. The Declaration of the French Revolution in 1791 on the rights of man and the citizen also states, all men are born free with equal rights and must always remain free and have equal rights. These are undeniable truths. Nevertheless, for more than 80 years, the French imperialists, abusing the standard of liberty, equality, and fraternity, have violated our fatherland and oppressed our people, our fellow citizens. They've acted contrary to the ideals of humanity and justice in the field of politics. They've deprived our people of every democratic liberty. They have enforced inhuman laws. They have set up 3 distinct political regimes in the north, the center, and the south of Vietnam in order to wreck our national unity, prevent our people from being united. And this is in fact what happens with the UN, basically making the division of North and South Vietnam, basically using the old French model. It's a unified country, always had been, but dividing rule strategy, North, Center, and South. They have built more prisons than schools. They have mercilessly slain our patriots. More prisons than schools. That sounds familiar. They have drowned our uprisings in river of blood. They have fettered public opinion. They have practiced obscurantism against our people to weaken our race. They have forced us to use opium and alcohol. Wow. In the fields of economics, they have fleeced us to the backbone, impoverished our people, and devastated our land. They have robbed us of our rice fields, our mines, our forests, our raw materials. They have monopolized the issuing of banknotes and the export trade. They have invented numerous unjustifiable taxes and reduced our people, especially our peasantry, to a state of extreme poverty. They have hampered the prospering of our national bourgeoisie. They have mercilessly exploited our workers. In the autumn of 1940, when the Japanese fascists violated Indochina's territory to establish new bases in their fight against the Allies, he didn't say American imperialists, but hey, the French imperialists went down on their bended knees and handed over our country to them without a fight. Thus, from that date, our people were subjected to the double yoke of the French and Japanese. Thus, from that date, our people were subjected to the double yoke. Their sufferings and miseries increased. The result was that from the end of last year to the beginning of this year, from Quang Tri province in the north of Vietnam, more than 2 million of our fellow citizens died of starvation. The French troops were disarmed by the Japanese. The French colonists either fled or surrendered, showing that not only were they incapable of protecting us, but in the span of 5 years, they had twice sold our country to the Japanese. On several occasions, the Viet Minh League urged the French to ally themselves with it against the Japanese. Instead of agreeing to this proposal, the French colonists so intensified their terrorist activities against the Viet Minh members that before fleeing, they massacred a great number of our political prisoners detained at Yen Bai and Chao Ban prisons. Notwithstanding all this, our fellow citizens have always manifested towards the French a tolerant and humane attitude. Even after the Japanese push of March 1945, the Viet Minh League helped many French to cross the frontier, rescued some of them from Japanese jails, protected French lives and property. So to go on, basically understand the context of this statement. Before the French, they've been fighting the Chinese for 800 years. And then the French come. Then the Japanese invade. They beat the Japanese. The French can hand over the country without a fight. And so he's declaring after the end of the war, after Hiroshima has been bombed, hey, we're Vietnam, come recognize us. And he's laying out an argument like this, just like the Declaration of Independence and the French Rights of Man, because remember, this is a college-educated man. So, what Hatfield told me, because I'll stop here and then we'll start doing final prep. Hatfield told me basically after this speech, because he's clearly recognizing and calling for help from the United States. The United States decided that they were going to create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the big enemy was going to be communism, even though the Soviet Union had been our ally in World War II against the Germans as well. But now they're going to shift and become an enemy, and they wanted France in NATO. France would not join NATO unless they got their colony back. Notice that. France won their colony back. No, you walked away from it. You lost. We won. Not your country anymore. We'll trade with you, but we're independent. So, terms of NATO, NATO, France joins NATO, gets their colony back, which of course the Vietnamese are not going to take this lying down. They fight the French, they beat the French. French calls communism, communism. That's how the United States gets into the war. By betraying an ally, a people of color ally, for essentially white supremacy, really. I mean, because Nike could have come, well, Nike didn't exist, but when Eisenhower, as we'll learn next term, basically talks about the reason we're going into Vietnam, he's not talking about maintenance of freedom, he's talking about tin and tungsten and oil.
And rubber.
And rubber, yes.
Yeah, that was the thing about the French.
Right. So, our communists, Tito in Yugoslavia, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. So, communist leaders who supported U.S. influence during World War II, and according essentially to Senator Hatfield, this is why we went into Vietnam. All right, so the midterm was designed and delivered to maximize its use as a teaching tool, not as a screening tool. Part of the answers require you go online for the answers, to dig for the answers, and the point isn't the answers, the point is reinforcing learning. So some answers require a thoughtful response, and thinking is hard work, which is often why it's rewarded with higher pay. But could take shortcuts. I obviously recommend that. So abuse of deadlines will not be tolerated in other classes with other instructors. So, question 1, in philosophy, axiology is a study of the nature of values and value judgments. In Edwin Nichols' 2, Edwin Nichols' axiology, construct attempts to bridge the worldview of all the world's people into 4 views or axiology. They are Euro-American, so you can just do the ethnic identification, that was acceptable. So Euro-American, and the axiology is the highest value is the object. African, Arab, South American, highest value is relationships. Asian, highest value is cohesion of the group. Native, which is the Nicholsian framework. Pan and Theos are all in great spirit.
That's going to be posted?
Yes.
It's already up.
It's already up, and will be up again. Right? Simply stated, logic is a way of reasoning to, so if you got this wrong, you have an opportunity to get it right. Because it's not about kicking you out of ethnic studies. You need to understand this. Alright? That's the idea. Alright? Simply stated. So notice how I set this up. Okay? The next questions are set up so if you answer it correctly, you get the correct answers for the following questions. But if you did it wrong, you didn't get it. Alright, so dichotomous logic, Euro-American axiological logic, diunital, African, conative, Asian, quadriunital, Native American, epistemology, way of knowing the world, counting and measuring, symbology, imagery, and rhythm, striving towards transcendence, 4 directions, cycle of life. See how that works? I can expect to see correct answers?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Reconstruction. What's being reconstructed? Physical infrastructure of the South, American citizenship of Africans in America. Who or what is Jim Crow? Code name for black people, policy of racial segregation, American apartheid, all the above except A, all are acceptable answers except for the alcohol, obviously. That's Jim Beam anyway. What type of racism is Jim Crow? I could go with overt institutional. I could go with unconscious institutional. I could go with type 1 conscious individual. But a single correct answer would be like type 4. Gandhi's philosophy, which translates from the Sanskrit into English, is satyagraha, holding on to truth, is what it means. Ida Wells Barnett conducted an organized campaign against lynching, allowing for the possibility that law enforcement often participated in such acts. What types of racism could lynching be? It could be overt institutional, overt individual, or overt institutional if the cops participated. It's institutional if the officials are participating, right, and not reporting. So people who practice or enthusiastically witness lynching were considered normal, upright citizens. This would be an example of sociostructural violence. So just to hammer that in, the definition by Frantz Fanon, where he's talking about any relation, process, or condition by which an individual or group violates the physical, social, or psychological integrity of another person or group. From this perspective, violence inhibits human growth, negates inherent potential, limits productive living, and causes death. Proposed definition rests on several assumptions. Violence is not isolated physical act or discrete random event. It's a relation, process, and condition undermining, exploiting, curtailing the well-being of the victim. So understand what he's saying here, and that's why our science takes this into account and expresses it. Western science does not. Second, the violations are not simply moral or ethical, but also physical, social, and or psychological. They involve demonstrable assault on or injury of and damage to the victim. Third, violence in any of the three domains, physical, social, or psychological, has significant repercussions in the other two domains. And so it's not just between individuals, but between groups and societies. And this is actually reinforced in case law, the fifth element. Intention is less critical than consequence in most forms of violence. So it's not about whether you intended to do it. You have to look at the impact. That's what case law recognizes. We don't know your intent unless you're dumb enough to say something. That's why the Supreme Court says, oh, racial profiling doesn't exist unless you catch the cop saying something. Because we don't know your intent. That's the legal principle. May be unjust. That's understand. Like Denzel said, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. 11. So, if your school curriculum Caucasianizes people whose contemporaries call them mulatto or blackamoor, what type of racism is that? Unconscious institution if the institution isn't aware or doesn't correct. Type 6, social structural violence, definitely B, quite possibly A. Right, so any of those three, but obviously I would prefer 1 or 2. But all three are acceptable. White man's burden is the supposed responsibility to civilize the non-white world, and a poem by Rudyard Kipling. Obviously I accept both, but obviously C is the better, more optimal answer. Oregon Constitution has exclusion laws which affect blacks, mulattoes, and Chinese. You can use the original language in the Constitution. Pre-presumptions of whiteness from Chris Cullinan's article. She's in HR at the university. Presumption of innocence, presumption of worthiness, presumption of competence. Niagara movement led to the formation of the NAACP. The CP and NAACP, what we would call people of color, also colored people internationally. When he was referring to the talented 10th, he was referring to only 10% of those who had talent would be recognized because of their color. He's not trying to be classist. He's just saying, look, let's spread the talent as far as we can, but only certain people are going to be recognized for it. Not that we think that's a good idea, but that's the reality. Black codes, post-Reconstruction laws that in effect reestablished slavery. 5 parts to Naim Akbar's African Self. Article 1, Section 34 of the Oregon Constitution, basically, what did it say? No slavery and voluntary servitude except for punishment for a crime, and became the 13th Amendment. 40 acres and a mule were slavery reparations suggested by the radical Republicans, not Lincoln. How many times do I have to say, Lincoln was a foe? Name the radical Republicans, Sumner and Stevens. There are others, but Sumner and Stevens, 3 black Reconstruction era politicians, Revels, Pinchback, and Elliott of the classic ones. Vicente Guerrero, black Indian president of Mexico who outlawed slavery. So, and then contrasting and compare the difference between Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk and the Souls of White Folk, I basically gave points if you had a cogent argument. If it was clearly improvised because you hadn't read, then you didn't get it. That's cool, but read. You must read. KRS-One says you must learn. All right, so they gave me the 2 minutes, so I can come back here and bring back your midterms if you want in 2 minutes. All right, okay. I'll be back. Oh, a final.
You're worried about you heading back to the midterm. I better get that final.
Yeah. Here you go. I'll be back. You can roll the ending credits, crew.
Lane Online. Learn, unlearn, relearn.